Hey everyone, welcome to this first talk of 7 on St Teresa of Avila's The Interior Castle, or El Castillo Interior, or Las Moradas, or the Mansions, but it's most commonly known as the Interior Castle. I'm going to try and keep these talks condensed to the content of the book itself without relying on scripture or secondary commentaries or dipping too much into St. Teresa's biography itself, but I will give a little bit of background on the text in this first talk. So this book was written in 1577 by St. Teresa of Avila, or St. Teresa of Jesus, as she's also commonly known, who was a Spanish Carmelite nun, and she now holds a place as one of the foremost mystics of the Catholic and Christian tradition. She's often seen and placed alongside St. John of the Cross, who I plan to do some talks on in the future. So, in short, the Interior Castle is a guide for spiritual development through prayer, meditation, and eventually contemplation, which we'll get to. It's often taken together with her other book, The Way of Perfection, and these are seen as blueprints, really, for people who wish to experience a deeper mystical union with God, or a potential union with God. We'll get to that word union in later talks. The work was inspired by a vision which she had, where she understood the soul as being a castle made of diamond or pure crystal, which we'll get to. And this castle contains 7 mansions, and she interprets and writes these 7 mansions as a journey of faith through 7 stages, ending with a mystical union with God. And for those that are more familiar with their Gospels and with the Bible, they will understand that this vision is likely inspired and understood. The idea of the mansions is likely inspired by John 14:2. In my Father's house there are many mansions. If not, I would have told you, because I go to prepare a place for you. Now, throughout writing this book, biographically speaking, St. Teresa is always struggling with her humility. She's always asking herself, what right does she have to write such a thing as a spiritual guide for other people? And at this stage in her life, she is, just an everyday member of the church, of her convent. And this struggle is seen throughout the text, and the main reason she comes to write it, because she feels that she shouldn't be, is because she has this vision of the mansions. It's a vision which is granted to her from God, and from that she understands that she has the right, in a way, to be able to write this book. But I say this because all the while one should keep in mind that St. Teresa is both hesitant in writing The Interior Castle, and she's also directing the book towards a very clear audience, which is the sisters of her convent. And much of the advice is at times clearly specific for them, and especially when we get to the later mansions, you'll see that we're dealing with extremely spiritually intense ideas, and much of what she's writing at that stage is about warning her sisters, in a way, about discerning between good and evil, or God or the devil, or things which are happening at a very, very deep level at that point. And while she's writing this, it's really of no doubt that she would have been struggling with many sort of physical ailments and sufferings and pain. So in a certain sense, when we get to those things, she is writing from a position of experience. However, I don't want to touch too much on the biography, because the life of St. Teresa of Jesus, the actual book of her life which she wrote, is really a mystical text in itself. So I'd like to do some talks on that by itself at another point. So to keep these talks focused and contained within the bounds of the Interior Castle itself, I'll add no further exposition on the book, and we can move into the mansions. So we need to understand the mansions in that way. Though I'll get to how to think about them. But we have these 7 mansions, which are somewhat stages, though it's difficult to entirely see them as stages because they do overlap. There is obviously transitions between the mansions, but there's somewhat of a clear progression. Now, they can be split into 3, 3, and then 1. So mansions 1 to 3 are active growth. Mansions 4 to 6 are infused growth or a more internal growth. And mansion 7 is literally mystical union with God. Now, what are the differences really between them just before we go on? Mansions 1 to 3, there is still an active element happening. We haven't really given ourselves fully over to God and sort of opened up fully. So there's still this active element of our own sort of self-willed effort in a sense. And then as we move into infused growth, it's a more intense relationship with grace and favors and what's being given from God. And then when we get to really 6 and 7, but especially 7, we're getting to a point where really St Teresa and myself will struggle to talk about those mansions because they are primarily of the experience of the people who has had them. They're not something you can talk about. And this is one of the problems that we'll find is this difference between experience and the intellect. But we'll get there. So to begin, St. Teresa has this vision of the soul as a castle made of pure crystal or pure diamond. And she understands from this vision that this castle has 7 dwelling places or 7 mansions. I will stick to calling them mansions, but some editions of the text call them dwelling places, some call them mansions. I'm sure there's probably a few other names, but we'll stick to mansions. So we have this castle made of pure crystal, which has 7 mansions in it. And this castle is understood to be the soul. And St. Teresa understands that in seeking a deeper connection with God, we must proceed through these 7 mansions. And so we begin here with the first mansion, as we should. And she states, just to quote and solidify that idea, it is that we consider our soul to be like a castle made entirely out of a diamond or a very clear crystal, in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven there are many dwelling places, leading us back to that idea in John. So this is something that we can't really comprehend in specifically an intellectual sense, that the intellect does play a part. This is something God himself takes a delight in, and at all times, even in these early stages, we're really dealing with symbols, and to attempt to comprehend this idea in its fullness, we will simply tire ourselves, St. Teresa says. The difference, in a way, between the castle and God, and the full understanding of it in that sense, is the same as the difference between God and his creatures. Okay, so God and his image. So in trying to fully comprehend the castle at any point, we are trying to comprehend the image of God. Okay, the soul is the breath of God, which has been breathed into us as the Spirit, is not truly something we're ever going to be able to fully comprehend. And so in this, given this symbol and this metaphor of the interior castle and of the 7 mansions and of these stages and of the ideas and prayers which are with them, we are given means towards a more full or a fuller comprehension. But St. Teresa is always emphasizing that there's always going to be this struggle of full comprehension, and many things she openly admits she doesn't understand. Okay, so the castle itself, when we think of it, St. Teresa says that it's placed upon a plainness, as in something being bland or plain, a plain landscape. Its setting is plain, okay? And actually, before we even venture into the castle, there is an outer wall. And we can understand this outer wall. So the castle itself, with its 7 mansions, is the soul. But the outer wall is our body, our flesh, the material. So body and soul, spirit and matter, man's peculiar middle place between things. And St. Teresa makes it clear that the majority of the time that we are alive, maybe for some people even all the time we are alive, we never actually really look at the castle itself. We limit ourselves to the consideration of the outer wall, the body, the flesh, material pleasures, the world. And rarely do we attempt to know ourselves by looking into the castle, which is our soul. Rarely do we look inwards. Okay. And she says this castle has many dwelling places, some up above, others down below, others to the sides, and in the center and middle is the main dwelling place, where the very secret exchanges between God and the soul take place. Now, we're given this overview then. We have the outer wall, which many people are caught up in the world, business affairs, worldly affairs, and we have the soul. And the importance and the center and almost like the goal of this, of the soul, of looking towards the soul and of looking inwards, is the fact that we can actually have exchanges with God there. And for St. Teresa, the very fact that such exchanges can even take place at all, okay, that we can have this conversation between God and ourselves, St. Teresa says at this point, are foul-smelling worms. This fact that we are granted this at all is something to always keep in mind, that creatures of the below, fallen creatures such as ourselves, can even come into contact with such goodness, such mercy, which is immeasurable. She says this is something to always keep in mind. So she does make it clear, however, that anyone who does not believe in the possibility of this conversation, and she's quite specific, she doesn't say anyone who doesn't believe in God. She's specific, she says anyone who doesn't believe in this conversation, to the possibility that one could have this, one could either hear God, one could possibly talk to God, or one could have a conversation with God. Anyone who does not believe in this conversation, or this conversation's ability to grow new favors, God's ability to grant favors, anyone who doesn't believe in this, doesn't turn inwards to the soul, doesn't look inwards towards the soul, doesn't look inwards towards themselves, and really we could say it's just focused on the worldly things, will have no experience of it. One could say in relation to Scripture that such people don't have eyes to see, they don't have ears to hear. So what we're talking about here, right at these beginning stages, at the outer wall and the first mansion, we are talking about people who even though they are struggling, and we all struggle, even though they're struggling with the outer wall and worldly things, they do want to see. They do want to try and make an effort in some sense. And so when we get back to the castle, the soul, our first question, once we've now looked at it and we've thought, wow, I want to venture there. I want to see what's going on. I want to be able to try and listen. Maybe there's some sense of something going on there. Maybe you're disillusioned in the world and you want to make these first steps. So the first question St. Teresa asks is, well, how do we enter? How do we enter the castle at all? And she says this is a very peculiar question when we begin to think about what the castle represents, what it is. Because if the castle is our soul, and the soul is within ourselves, whatever that means with respect to the spirit, then it seems to us that we shouldn't have to enter it. How can we enter a room that we're already within? Right? It's our soul. But it's a question of the different ways one may be inside the soul, inside the castle. And because she's made clear that there are many souls who are in the outer courtyard, completely caught up in the outer walls. So there's still always this possibility that you might not enter it. You know, what is our relationship with the soul at this point? What is our relationship with the castle? Are we actually in our soul at all? Because in that split between the matter, flesh, body, and spirit, soul, God, the divine, between that split, if one is caught up solely in matter, worldly things, and their fallen nature, and, you know, the world which is of the prince and of the devil, if one is solely caught up with that, then the relationship with spirit and the soul and the castle is going to be one of possibly just complete neglect. And so she says, well, how do we enter this castle? She says that prayer is advised to enter. Okay, prayer allows us to enter within ourselves. The kingdom of God is within us, and prayer allows us to begin that entry into that kingdom. And she says that thus those that don't pray are crippled in the sense that they have no relationship between their external matters and their internal matters. There is nothing higher for the people caught up in the external, caught up in these outer walls. There is nothing higher than them to give them orders. Okay? She states, such people are now so used to dealing always with the insects and vermin that are in the walls surrounding the castle that they have become almost like them. Okay? They're crawling around like beasts and vermin. And she says the only cure for these souls' disorientation on the outside in the outer walls of the castle is to turn to God. Okay? Outside of this, there is no remedy. And how do we turn to God? Prayer. So the door of entry to the castle, and almost not the price of entry, but the way to enter, is prayer and reflection. And so, in prayer and reflection, whereby the mansion is within ourselves, in prayer, we turn into our souls, which itself, as we understand, is the breath of God, which is spirit. So in prayer, we turn to our souls, which is spirit. The prayer she speaks of, however, isn't vocal. Okay, one which, and this carries through intensely. This increases in its quality. The prayer she speaks of isn't vocal. It's one of openness, where one is not aware of who they are speaking to, what they are asking, who they are asking. She pushes against prayer of, rote, where you are simply stating something over and over and over again, repeating prayers learned of habit. This is not the kind of prayer, she says, will gain access to this castle. And so, now we know how to get in, what it is to get in. From now on, we are speaking only of the soul and the souls who, in the end up in the castle. All the others, she says, are just in the hands of the Lord. Nothing more can be done for them other than what the Lord will grant them. Okay. Sometimes, she says, such souls may push aside all the vermin of the world, open up just enough space for them to enter into the castle, and thus open up just enough space to let God in. But they drag in so many reptiles and vermin that they are actually prevented from seeing the beauty of the castle once they're inside it. They've sort of dragged the world in with them a bit too much, and so they can't really see what all the fuss is about in a way. They can't see the beauty of the castle. And we'll get to this idea of a cloth over beauty soon. But she says there's a little bit of hope there by the mere fact they've entered. Okay, and so now we're entering into the castle. She thinks about what it is for this castle to be of pure crystal, because this is one of the primary elements of the vision, is that the castle she was granted as a favour to see in this vision is of pure crystal. Okay. And she places the fact it's pure crystal in relation to mortal sin. Okay. So mortal sin for her is obscure. It's black. There is no darker darkness than mortal sin, she says. So in between these two positions, one can see the role that the light of the Lord, or the metaphor of the idea and the symbol of light in general, plays here. Okay, for in mortal sin, in the state of complete obscure darkness, by its very definition, cannot let light in. Okay, darkness by its definition does not let light in. Okay, if the light came in, it wouldn't be darkness. And so we can think of this almost as a spectrum in a way, where on the one side we have this crystal castle, this pure crystal soul as a gift from God, and on the other side we have this pure light from God. Okay, so when the light enters into the castle, it radiates the light out completely. That's what the crystal does. But of course, if we're in a state of mortal sin, when the light enters, what does it enter into? Darkness. It just doesn't radiate out in the same way. And in this sense, St Teresa states, all the good work it might do while in mortal sin are fruitless for the attainment of glory. All the good works it might do while in mortal sin are fruitless for the attainment of glory. And this is because when the light hits the soul, which is in the state of mortal sin, it's only hitting darkness. And this for St Teresa is almost a digression on the notion that there can't be an abidance to a greater good, right? The idea of like, well, what if we just do this thing which we know is bad now, a greater good will come of it. Because one, you are stating by doing that you know God's will, that you know the future somehow better than God, which we don't. But also from what St. Teresa is saying, that when you're trying to do that thing of, well, a greater good will come of it, well, what the light has to do, it has to pass through the evil, the mortal sin, to then achieve the good. And in that sense, boom, once the light hits the mortal sin, it's like a cloth over any goodness, and everything from that point on is tainted with the darkness. And she says here that in the same way that all the streams, and water is a big metaphor in this book, that flow from the crystal clear fountain that could be found in this pure soul in grace, equally can think of that stream being tainted once they're within mortal sin, and anything that flows with that stream is wretched. Okay, and so the main metaphor she uses is that the pure beauty and radiance which is at the center of the soul doesn't change in itself. The light doesn't change, but it is refracted through a black cloth of mortal sin that's placed over it. So the light itself doesn't change, but it's refracted through the mortal sin. And this is what's happening. So the light comes into the castle, and if it's in a state of grace, it has the ability to shine and shimmer this light out. If it isn't, then things that come from it are tainted. Now, when we look back to the castle, these rooms aren't linear. Okay, one doesn't follow after the other in the sense of a very clear linear progression. Okay, and this is one of the struggles of the book. In the same way that it is the interior castle is a journey for someone to take, it would also be wrong to think about it like right, I've done castle 1, I've ticked that box, right now on to the next stage of progression, as if the ascent upwards is entirely quantified, would be wrong. Okay, so it's not linear. It's a qualitative relationship with intense spiritual internal relationship which is happening, and these rooms are really allow us symbolically to understand relatively clear stages one might go through. But in the sense that these aren't linear, there is like an anchor of how to almost understand the progression, which is our eyes should always be fixed towards the center, and the center plays a very, very key role, because in the sense that we are in a way moving from the outer walls through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the center, the seventh. What are we moving towards? And St. Teresa calls this the royal chamber, where the king stays. Okay, so this castle, these rooms, they are plentiful, they're huge, they are always they're always capable of so much more than we imagine. But within this central royal chamber shines a sun which fills all these other rooms with light. And in prayer, what we're doing is allowing this light to flow through the rooms, and in this sense we can get back to the idea that the light in this center, which we get to eventually, never changes. It's always ourselves who are obfuscating or obscuring or placing these cloths over things and stopping the light from flowing. It's always us. The light itself and the source never changes, but we will get to the source. So what's actually going on in this first room, this first dwelling place, this first mansion, in the sense that we're asking the question, what do we need, first of all, before all things, to head towards God, right? This is the first point of call. You're saying, well, if we're now heading to God, we've made that turn, we're saying, okay, there's something going on, I want to move past these outer walls, what is this strange castle? We're asking this question, what's the first thing we need? And after prayer and reflection, we need self-knowledge. Okay, the first room is really the self-knowledge to ask the question as to why you may want all the other rooms at all. Why is it one wants to approach God? And this self-knowledge for St. Teresa will hopefully imbue us with what she considers the most important thing whilst we are here on earth. The most important thing that can be of earth for her: humility. And this plays a role throughout every single room, even through to the seventh. But this self-knowledge is always a form of feedback. It's not really solely self-knowledge, okay? In knowing ourselves, in looking inwards to the soul, because that soul is of God, it's of the Spirit, in coming to know ourselves, we come to know God, and in coming to know God, we come to know ourselves. As we gaze at his perfection, we come to know our imperfection. As we gaze at his purity and we receive it, we come to know our own impurity. So it's this constant reciprocal self-knowledge which can only exist with grace there as well. Okay, so in this first room, perhaps in this sense, that we have still this closest connection to our own egotistical desires, the material things, what St Teresa calls the beasts and the vermin and the outer wall. Because it's so close, it's actually one of the richest and most precious rooms. Okay, because if we manage to slip away from everything and have that very deep internal realization that this stuff doesn't really matter, there's nothing left to do but advance. And in the sense that it's rich, we're really afforded in that very close relationship between the outer wall and between the material world, and between being able to still sort of see, oh, it's very selfish there, I've got greed, I've got all these fallen problems. We still have that very rich relationship where the self-knowledge increases quite substantially because we're still so close to it. But in trying to move through the mansion, there are hindrances. There are always legions of devils ready to stop us from moving from one mansion, one room to another, to basically progressing closer towards God. There are things which are trying to stop us. And when we once again look at this in the idea of a spectrum, so from the outer wall moving forward all the way to the central room, which is mystical union with God, we realize that in the first mansion, this is the place where the devil would have so many more legions, because this is the point where we can still in some ways just fall back and be absorbed straight back into the world, because we're still very close to the world. Okay, so this is a position where we're at our most, the most possible to being pulled back to the vanities of the world. And in this first room, in that sense, with all the temptations from the devil, it's equally as difficult, because we're also as closest to the devil as can be, and in this stage of the journey, we are as far away from the king's royal chamber, the center light, as can be, which means the light hardly reaches this room. The room is rich because there's so much to use to move forward, but it's delicate because the light is only just reaching this room. The light itself, once again, is still complete in its perfection. The light hasn't changed, but it's obscured at its most at this point, okay, by what St Teresa calls snakes and vipers and poisonous creatures, disallowing the soul to be aware of the light and of itself. But we should always emphasize that it's not them that are literally covering our eyes. It's always our own will which seeks to be oh yeah, we'll agree with you instead. And so this obfuscation of the light is truly a condition of the soul. It's sort of saying that we're still involved with the possessions and affairs of the world, and it's in the striving to the second place where we strive to give up these things. And so in concluding the first mansion, St. Teresa makes it clear that a lot of the time, right at the end here, she is writing for her sisters, and so she's talking to them about not entering into gossip, entering into silence, not giving oneself over to the things of the world. And so in this first mansion, in a certain sense, we see the very beginnings of the journey, which is the beginning of a differentiation and an internalization of a difference between the world and the spirit, of matter and the spirit, the world and the soul. It's to look at finally turn towards the mansion and away from those outer walls, okay? Which is to say, it's to begin that journey towards the breath of God, towards the soul and the spirit, and towards God ultimately, and away from material and the material world. And in doing so, we look more into the soul, and the more we move away from the things of the world. And so, to sum it up, we finally turn towards the soul, which is our own soul, towards the internal life. In doing so, we turn our back to the material world, but in doing that turn, we have an understanding of how much that world hinders us, and the way in which we begin to enter and do enter in is prayer, it's meditation, and through that we enter into self-knowledge, which itself is a reciprocal relationship of we come to know ourselves, we come to know God, we come to know God, come to know ourselves. And so we enter through an open prayer. So that has been the first mansion. I hope you all found it helpful. And for those that want to carry on, this should be a little playlist and you can move forward into the second mansion. So thank you very much.